and welcome to the Psychotropic Deprescribing Council's educational webinar series. My name is Karen Hoffman, and I serve on the PDC board. The PDC is committed to advancing safe, responsible, and patient-centered approaches to tapering and deprescribing psychotropic medications, including antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, and benzodiazepines. We believe that deprescribing psychotropics should always include the intention of recovery and support forward when needed. It's not just about reducing medication, but about fostering long-term healing, stability, and quality of life. Today, we are pleased to present clinical psychiatric researcher and clinician, Dr. Mark Horowitz. Mark is the originator of the Horowitz-Taylor method for hyperbolic tapering of psychotropics and lead author of the 2024 Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines for antidepressants, benzodiazepines, gabapentoins, and Z-drugs.
Thanks, Karen, for the introduction. Thank you, Adele. Background there. I think the laryngitis for inviting me, I'll share my slides in a second, and I'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. I was told that this is a well-informed audience who already knows what hyperbolic tapering is, so I won't have to bore you to tears by going through that. I'm going to talk a bit about how far hyperbolic tapering has spread around the world, what resistance it's met, and what the kind of barriers are to further implementation. What sort of issues I hear as I talk to doctors and to different health systems about what makes it difficult to implement. And then if there's a bit of time, I'll talk about some of the trickier clinical issues that I run into in running deprescribing clinics. So here's a sort of thumbnail sketch of the history of hyperbolic tapering. I mean, I should say this is sort of the academic clinical history. I guess the background is that, of course, patients have worked out how to taper their drugs over decades of experimentation. I think some of these ideas first originated with Heather Ashton and Peter Breggin in different books, and there, of course, has become a thriving culture online of people coming off these drugs. But I guess I'm talking about when it entered the academic and clinical mainstream, which is in the last few years. So the first papers on hyperbolic tapering were published, one by Brian Shapiro, 2018, and one by myself and David Taylor in 2019 in the Lancet Psychiatry. The year after that, the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, that's the equivalent of the American Psychiatric Association in America, put out detailed guidance on how to take someone off an antidepressant, including hyperbolic tapering with some example regimens. And now it's been updated actually in the last year or two to include details on how to implement this with off-label options, things like crushing up tablets and making suspensions and opening up capsules to count beads. So the Royal College of Psychiatrists sounds more and more like surviving antidepressants in some respects. Probably of even more importance, 2 years later, the UK National Guidance, which is the NICE guidelines people might have heard about, which is guidance essentially put out by a government department for all doctors in the country, and it included instructions on how to stop antidepressants, benzodiazepines, opioids, and Z-drugs, and it recommended hyperbolic tapering. It used this sort of description: slow, stepwise, rate of reduction proportionate to the existing dose, so that decrements become smaller as the total dose is lowered. It didn't provide a lot of detail, which is one of its major drawbacks, despite a lot of pushing from patient advocates. It wanted to see, we'll return to this, it wanted to see randomized controlled trials proving that these techniques worked before it gave specific advice, which, as I'll come back to, I think is a bit peculiar because the advice that they give is not based on any randomized controlled trials. but I think that's a lot to do with inertia in the system. In the last year or two, actually the NHS, the National Health Service, that is in the UK, is working on a project to encourage hyperbolic tapering for all prescribers. That means GPs, pharmacists, and other doctors, with sort of easy-to-use tools, kind of instructions. Give 3.2 milligrams, use this liquid with 2.6 mils, etc. So that it's sort of spoon-fed to clinicians to try to make it easy for them to follow. And that has sort of come about because the NICE guidelines have been too vague. So this is sort of an attempt to fill in the gaps. It remains to be seen how it's taken up by the system, but it's involved quite a lot of people working on it, including Anne Guy, who's the mastermind behind it. I hope that will have an effect on practice. I've been very UK-centric because I think there's been a lot more action in the UK than there has been elsewhere, but moving further afield. In Canada, the Therapeutics Initiative, which is a government-funded but independent group who looks at safety of medication use in Canada, and they're kind of renowned for not taking money from drug companies. They give very objective advice, which is often very useful, and they put guidance together on withdrawal effects from antidepressants and how to taper off hyperbolically, which went up just in the last few weeks. In 2025, this year, Australian guidance that's widely used also mentions hyperbolic tapering, not as it recommends it only for difficult cases. So there is a mention of it. It's not the main technique recommended. And then I guess I should mention that the publication of the textbook that I helped to write, the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines, is not officially sanctioned by the health system, but it has been endorsed in Australia by the College of General Practice and the Pharmaceutical Society in the UK. And there's been a philanthropic organisation in Australia, the Wilson Foundation, that has helped to make hundreds of copies available for free to GPs and pharmacists. So these things are leaking into practice and into doctors' minds little by little. I occasionally get an email from a patient who says that the doctor they've just asked for a liquid, says that they understand why, they've heard of this new technique, although, of course, I also hear the opposite, that they've never heard of any of this stuff, and what is the patient talking about, and why would they need a liquid when they can just stop the drug in a few weeks? So there's been patchy uptake. So this is the book that some of you might have heard of, that we published beginning of last year, and we essentially tried to set out that it would be a clinical handbook that would provide all the information that any GP, psychiatrist, pharmacist, nurse would need to help somebody come off their psychiatric drug, to recognize withdrawal effects, to distinguish withdrawal from relapse, and we give guidelines on how to either quickly, slowly, or moderately come off all of the prescribed drugs available in America, in the UK, and around the world, and including advice on which formulations to use. And there's been quite positive reception of the book. It's sold well, actually, on Amazon, albeit a deeply evil website. It does give you a sense of how well the book is selling. In general, it's only in the psychiatry section, it's only outsold by the DSM, the diagnostic manual. It's got a lot of positive ratings, and this is a few weeks out of date. It's got a lot of positive reports. These are from clinicians who say it's currently the only text that systematically deals with the important topic of reduction and or deprescription of medications. And this person suggesting it should be read before the prescribing guidelines, which is a kind of companion book on how to start the drugs. And of course, I agree. It's more important that you've got a brake on your car before you turn the engine on. So I think that makes sense. And a Canadian doctor has said very few prescribers know how to support people to finish a course of medication. Many are afraid. They don't know how to interpret the feelings that come up. And she recommends that pharmacists, prescribers, and all kinds, and citizen scientists with a personal stake in the safe handling of these drugs. This should be welcomed. That was very nice to see these positive reviews. And interestingly, probably not surprisingly, a lot of patients have bought the book in order to give to their doctors. In some ways, I find that very sad. That patients have to buy books, textbooks, clinical handbooks for their prescribers, but such is the way it's turned out. People say it validates their experience. It's a blueprint for safe deprescribing. People hope it's a step towards people understanding psychiatric drugs and their long-term effects better. People have said it's concise, and every psychiatrist should read this book. So it's been gratifying to hear positive responses from patients. I can't say that everybody is a fan. This is a typically incisive critique written by an American psychiatrist. I think he's a Harvard-educated psychiatrist, and he wrote poorly written, bad book, 1 star. Unfortunate. I don't think I've got a fan there. I certainly don't want to present this as altogether a success story. There are a lot of barriers to it being accepted more widely. I'll give some examples. In Australia, the College of Psychiatry there writes guidelines, and it recommended against using hyperbolic tapering because its primary reason was it's too difficult to make up such small doses. It's easier just to split tablets. They said, well, for drugs like venlafaxine or Effexor and duloxetine or Cymbalta, the fact that there are no tablets means it's very hard to taper, but they don't offer any solution. So I think the implication is that it's too much trouble to taper off hyperbolically, and they've therefore recommended that doctors keep doing what they're doing, which is very unfortunate. There was a similar response from the Canadian equivalent group. It's called the CANMAT Guideline Group. They're a group of psychiatrists that write guidelines. They do include a lot of people, like the Australian Psychiatry College guidelines. They include a lot of people that take quite a lot of money from drug companies, and they also recommend against using hyperbolic tapering. They say that there's not enough evidence for it to be used, and again, that it's too difficult to make up such small doses for 2 reasons. In America, it's a bit harder to discern what people are thinking because there hasn't been any update to the guidelines since 2010. The guidelines still say that withdrawal is brief and mild, and that tapering over 6 weeks is adequate for most people. I have heard via a New York Times journalist that the APA is working on guidelines for deprescribing. I'm not sure what form that might take or where that project is up to. And I'm also aware that Stephen Stahl, who is a famous psychopharmacologist who publishes a lot of the prescribing guidelines in America, is working on a deprescribing guideline that will be published, I think, early next year. Well, I'm not sure what it'll have inside it. So I just wanted to. Adele told me there are people that might be wanting to give lectures about hyperbolic tapering to their local seminars or hospitals or interested groups. And I guess it's interesting to know what the kind of responses I get when I give lectures. So I've now given probably about 400 lectures on hyperbolic tapering. Maybe you can tell by the sense of exhaustion in my voice. And I've got a whole range of responses. I often get some people that are very enthusiastic in the audience, different doctors. I get people coming up to me afterwards and saying, I've had trouble coming off my drugs. This is a GP speaking, or a psychiatrist sometimes, or my sister has, or my child, or my wife, or my husband. And I've used your book to help them come off. Or others have started to say that they're using this in their practices. And they ask me questions like, is it better to count beads? Is it better to use liquids? They're asking very practical questions. Sometimes I get people that look a bit confused in the audience. They've heard from lots of people that withdrawal is not a big thing. and then to hear from me that it can be very severe and that there's a very, a more complicated way of getting people off. They look a bit unsure. I kind of can understand that if you've received 50 lectures from, every professor you've ever encountered saying these drugs are easy to stop and you can halve them and then halve them again, to have sort of one slightly awkward-looking lecturer with thick glasses and balding hair turn up and say, that's all wrong, you should do things completely differently. I think people find that a little bit hard to assimilate into their knowledge. And then I will get people who are critical in a lecture and say that, it doesn't match their experience, it doesn't seem necessary. And I guess I want to focus most on that last group, people who are critical of the material that I present, and sort of talk through what criticisms they bring and what responses I think make sense to give you guys a better idea of what's going on. So for example, I'll hear some people say, people don't get withdrawal as much as you're suggesting that they do. They relapse, they have a return of their underlying condition. And I guess I say a variety of different things in response to this. I think one thing is it's often very hard for clinicians to spot things they haven't been taught exists. So sometimes when I'm hearing from clinicians say, they don't see withdrawal, they see relapse, I'm always wondering, well, if you haven't been taught to spot it, to diagnose it, it's probably not very easy to see. But I guess, one question I try to sort of put out broadly is, what is more common, withdrawal or relapse? The textbooks say relapse is the horse and withdrawal is the zebra. I don't know if you know that maxim from medicine. If you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras. But I think that is a problematic assumption. So, let's talk about relapse. So, what is relapse? Most people are prescribed drugs like antidepressants. I'm focusing now on antidepressants mostly in anxiety and depression, not on all psychiatric drugs. Most people are prescribed these drugs in response to something going wrong in their lives: divorce, job loss, moving cities, death of a loved one. And so I think for a lot of people, it doesn't really make sense for relapse to exist. You can't have a relapse of divorce unless you're very unlucky. Most people accommodate to the loss, move on in their lives. And so to suggest that everybody that has a period of depression has a lifelong recurring condition, is not well supported. On the other hand, withdrawal is very common. So there's been a lot of debate about what is the rate of withdrawal. From a review from Davies and Reed a few years ago, the incident rate was 56%. There's been a more recent review saying it's as low as 15%. I think the answer is it really matters how long you've been on the drug for. So in this picture on the right-hand side, there's duration of use before you stop your antidepressant. On the top is risk of withdrawal. And on the bottom is the withdrawal moderately severe or severe. And you can see that if you look at short-term use, withdrawal is relatively uncommon. Not that uncommon, but it's more like a quarter or a third of people. By the time you're on the drugs for years, it's more like 2/3 of people. And when you're on the drugs only for a short period of time, mostly it's mild symptoms. Only less than 1 in 5 people are having moderate or severe symptoms. But by the time you're on the drugs for years, almost half of people are having moderately severe or severe symptoms. So, these different studies look at different lengths. So when drug company studies look at short-term use, they find withdrawal is rare, and longer-term use finds withdrawal is more common. And then I'll just talk about this very briefly. The studies that find that relapse is quite common after drugs are stopped are based on discontinuation studies. That is, people that are better on antidepressants were randomized to stop or continue, and they're measured, their depression scores are measured for months or up to a year after stopping. When you look at these studies, they find that 40% of people relapse when they have their drugs stopped, and less than 20% relapse when they stay on the drugs. And this is why guidelines around the world recommend long-term treatment. But you probably can see the problem with this sort of setup is in the group that stop their antidepressants, it's often done over a few days or at most a few weeks. Withdrawal effects include low mood, anxiety, panic attacks, suicidality. That will register as relapse on these measures. And so a good proportion of this relapse will actually be withdrawal effects. And some people have estimated that actually the entire difference between these two groups is because of withdrawal misclassified as relapse. So it's still, to me, an open question as to whether antidepressant use actually prevents relapse or whether it just prevents withdrawal. And so you can see, putting that all, so this is just to illustrate that. The DES is withdrawal scores. These are depression scores. When you stop a drug for a few days, you get a big surge in depression scores that goes away when you put the drug back, showing that this depression is clearly driven by withdrawal. And so I think it's probably more likely that withdrawal is more common than relapse, the opposite of what most textbooks say. The other kind of response I'd get from people is people are fine with, this is very much related, they're fine with 4-week tapers. It's been in the guidelines for years that you can halve a drug and then halve it again. And it's, this must be based on evidence because we've been taught it in medical school. In actual fact, that guidance has not been based on any evidence. There was a single study done that showed that stopping drugs abruptly caused severe or caused very common withdrawal effects. And the committee at the time decided that 4 weeks made sense in terms of for tapering, on the premise that withdrawal was brief and mild for a week or two. And of course, that premise was based on studies in which people had been on antidepressants only for 8 to 12 weeks. And so there actually is not trials that show that 4-week tapers work. In fact, there's the opposite. In the UK, a randomized trial showed that most people, in fact, a very selected group of very well people, were not able to stop their antidepressants over a few weeks of tapering, and most were stuck on them. And of course, that's why you have hundreds of thousands of people on peer support groups like Surviving Antidepressants for whom a 4-week taper did not work out well at all. Again, another related question. People say to me, well, what you're saying sounds plausible. You've got these nice pictures of receptor occupancy, and there's some studies using tapering strips showing that this works, but is there enough evidence for a change in practice? I kind of understand this, just because someone says that, meditation made them feel better. Does that mean we should give meditation to everybody for, that condition? The issue is that current practice is not based on randomized controlled trials. So it's not like hyperbolic tapering is trying to displace a very well evidenced technique, in which case it would need equally well, an equally well robust evidence base. It is displacing something that is based on expert consensus, and there is lots of evidence that shows that it doesn't work for most people. So I would say the bar for producing enough evidence that hyperbolic tapering works is lower than people think. And there are actually meta-analyses showing that tapering over a few months is better than tapering over a few weeks. And you may be aware of studies from Holland using tapering strips to implement hyperbolic tapering show that a lot of people who couldn't get off their drugs using traditional tapering approaches can get off with hyperbolic tapering. They're not randomized trials, but they are within-person cohort studies. I won't belabor this point. This is showing that basically long tapers over several months are much better than short tapers over a few weeks. And I mentioned these are the tapering studies that show that most people can stop when they're given this sort of hyperbolic taper. And if you ask them, how severe were your withdrawal effects? With the usual taper, most people say it was very severe. And with this hyperbolic taper, using tapering strips, most people say it was 2 out of 7, a lot less severe. And the other thing to say is, people maybe have heard me talk about the law of mass action. The reason why there's this hyperbolic relationship between dose of drugs and effect on the brain, is a universal law of pharmacology. So it's just the shape of the road. It's not. It's very hard to argue for linear tapering, reducing by 5 milligrams every couple of weeks, when you understand that the road is curved, so to speak. So just to remind people, this is sort of graph I show quite often. Citalopram on the x-axis and effect on the bone on the y-axis. The black curved line is that hyperbolic curve, and you can see that going down by even amounts requires this sort of smaller and smaller size reductions at hyperbolic tapering. I think this might be barrier number 4, not number 3. People say it's too much trouble. They say the time, effort, and follow-up of patients is too much trouble. And I guess, look, the answer is it is more trouble to taper somebody off over several months or years using liquids or other ways than to stop by halving the dose and then quartering again for the doctor. Obviously, for the patient, it's a different story. You know, you have to, it's only less trouble if you ignore that patients sometimes develop akathisia, suicidality, protracted withdrawal, go to hospital, are disabled long term. So I would argue in this context, a few extra visits, a bit more expensive medication, more follow-up is not as burdensome as disabling people for years. I think the problem is, and I think this is a major area that needs to be addressed, is most doctors, the health system around the world is not aware of the enormity of the problems caused by withdrawal effects. If people think that withdrawal is a couple of weeks of headache and dizziness, then sure, hyperbolic tapering over months and years, is overkill. It's only when people understand that, akathisia, suicidality, protracted withdrawal are the consequence of not doing it, that then you realize actually it's quite cheap to spend some money on liquids. So I think it's very hard to get people to pay attention to these things. I think that's why advocacy and research can help clinicians and the health system understand how serious the harms from coming off the drugs too quickly can be. Again, related to this, same kind of issue. Liquids, compounded medications are too expensive. Again, the same thing. Yes, they are more expensive than tablets and capsules, but compared to the cost of people's lives being disrupted and the health system, it is not expensive at all. I would say a bit glibly, it's like saying that building stairs on a building to help people get down is too expensive. I'll just give one example. So I helped to run a clinic in America called Outro Health that helps people to stop antidepressants. And we ran a pilot version of this in Canada. And just looking at the people that wanted to come off venlafaxine Effexor, 16% of them had been to hospital in past attempts before coming to Outro and coming off their antidepressants, and none of them, whilst they were at Outro, coming off in a hyperbolic way. So whatever the costs of liquids are, it's certainly less than 1 in 6 people ending up in hospital. And in fact, some liquids are not even that expensive in the US and other places because they're made by manufacturers. So even the costs are not as great as people think they are. People also say when I talk about liquids and off-label options, crushing up tablets, if liquids are not available, people say it's prone to inaccuracy and complex for patients. And again, I'd agree. That's true. It is more complicated and it is more inaccurate than swallowing a tablet. But again, that's got to be played off against the harms of coming off the drugs too quickly. I think most people, if it was between going to hospital or being disabled for many years, would choose to learn how to use a syringe, or in many cases pay, a compounding pharmacy to make up doses to help them taper. And in fact, there was a recent systematic review done by pharmacists in Ireland that found that actually most of these off-label approaches actually meet the same accuracy as required by the FDA for licensed drugs. So these techniques are not as inaccurate as people say they are. There's a legal risk that's brought up sometimes. A manufacturer for a licensed drug takes the legal risk of a drug given. If a doctor recommends to do something that's off-label, the risk theoretically is on their shoulders. Again, I would say, there is risk to keeping people on drugs that they don't need. There's a risk to coming off too quickly. So, yes, there probably is a slight risk here, but I think that's got to be balanced by the other side of the risks of too quickly tapering or staying on the drugs. I want to give some time for questions and answers, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. This is the kind of approach that we suggest in the Maudsley Guidelines. This is what I use in my clinic. We get people to rate their symptoms out of 10 after reducing a dose. And what you often see is a withdrawal wave where symptoms, so someone reduces their dose at day 0, symptoms take a few days or a couple of weeks to build up, they reach a maximum, they get better, go away, and this would be a very successful reduction. People are experiencing 3 out of 10 symptoms. Everyone's a bit different, but most people would call that tolerable, and I would keep going at the same rate. If someone got it to 6 or 7 out of 10 symptoms, I would think that's a bad sign. I would either slow down the taper, pause, or go back a step. And this is exactly what you're trying to avoid. Symptoms going up to 8, 9, or 10, that's severe trouble, and that would be a sign to go back to your original dose, wait to stabilize, and then go down a lot more slowly. Probably end here. So micro-tapering, I sort of reserve this for people who find cut and hold too difficult. And basically the idea behind it is rather than making a reduction every month, let's say you want to go down by 3 milligrams of a month, say that's 10% of 30 milligrams. Rather than doing that in one big jump, which is like jumping down a whole set of stairs, 30 steps at a go, it can be easier to go down by 1/30th of that every day. So rather than 3 milligrams the first day of the month, to go down by 0.1 milligrams every day. And that, in the same way as going down 1 step a day for 30 days, would reduce the impact on your knees. So would this reduce the impact on your nervous system? And for this, you need a liquid, you need a syringe, dilute solution makes it easier, and that often makes withdrawal a lot more easier for people. I'll just go through this last point. So protracted withdrawal, this is definitely one of the most awful conditions to manage in psychiatry. This is when someone has come to you, they've been off the drug, say, for a few months, they have all sorts of symptoms, they're in a lot of trouble, and they want to know what their options are. And basically, there's 3 options. There's the conservative option, wait it out. People tend to get better. It can take months or years. That can be pretty devastating to hear. The less drugs people are exposed to, the quicker they tend to heal. And to use whatever non-drug options are available to try to manage their symptoms is the best thing. Reinstatement is option 2. If you reinstate the drug within a few days or a couple of weeks, it's often trivial. It works out very well. If you wait many weeks or months, it's often more unpredictable, in which case reinstating it at a very small dose, something like 5% of the minimum therapeutic dose, is a good place to start to test people's responses, to see if they respond positively or negatively, and then use that to guide further increases. And if people are in real dire straits, in other words, they're suicidal, they can barely hold things together, that would be the only circumstance that I would consider adding in more drugs. And it's not to treat a mental illness, it's really to sedate or to numb some of the unpleasant symptoms they're experiencing. And I think there's going to be negative long-term effects to that. They're going to have to come off those drugs. They're going to experience the side effects. And sometimes people can react badly to new psychotropic drugs when they're in this state. So it's a very fraught process, which I would suggest using very small doses of one drug at a time to see people's responses before deciding to continue or stop the drug. It can work for some people. Some people are prepared to sort of pay the long-term tax of being on these drugs, get a bit of short-term relief. I'll leave it there. These are some examples of things from the textbook, and I'll go happy to answer any questions.
We've got some very thoughtful questions here. I'm going to start with one of the first ones, Mark. Lori asks, do you think protracted withdrawal can continue after acute withdrawal, or does it typically start after a delayed withdrawal response? And then she further asks, do you think that physical symptoms typically start before the emotional ones? And could this help physicians diagnose correctly?
So I'm going to go back so I can see this question a bit better. Does protracted withdrawal start after acute withdrawal? I mean, I guess I've seen two patterns, and I'm interested to hear other people's views. Some people have some acute symptoms on stopping that are not very severe, and then maybe it gets better or it hangs around, and then it kind of gets worse and turns into a more severe syndrome, protracted withdrawal syndrome. So it has sort of a biphasic pattern. It goes up and then again. But some people, it just, the acute symptoms just continue into chronic symptoms. So people have a terrible time coming off and it just doesn't go away. And so you just see, more uniphasic pattern. People are sick from the get-go and then get worse. I guess I've also seen people who are fine after stopping their drugs for a few days, weeks, or even months, and then have terrible symptoms that have a delayed onset. So I guess there's all sorts of different patterns. Early bad, then worse bad later on. Early bad, continue bad. Early okay, and then bad later on. It's very hard to know how many people are in each one. And so what was this? The second part of that question was...
Do you think physical symptoms typically start before emotional symptoms?
Yes, I do. I do see that a bit. Yes, I think that is a bit true. Yes.
And then she goes on to ask, have you identified a length of therapy as a risk factor for withdrawal? And then have you looked at discrete episodes of treatment as a risk factor? And what appearance?
Right. So absolutely yes. Duration of treatment is the major risk factor for withdrawal. We did an analysis of a study. Very little came out, actually, other than duration of use. A little bit of evidence for, some drugs are worse than others. That's definitely, that's obviously the case. But the major factor was duration of use. I understand her question, episodes of treatment sort of implies, kindling, going on and off drugs over time. We haven't asked that in surveys, so I don't know. But anecdotally, yes, I see that. I hear people say, first time I came off a drug, no major issue. Second time, a bit more troublesome. Now, third time, it's been hugely troublesome. So, yes, I think that probably is the fact. But studies haven't shown that yet.
And John writes, will there be a section for lithium in the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines, Volume 2?
There will be.
Is there any time frame for when the Volume 2 is going to be out?
Yeah, when the lead author has some energy to finish it off, and so
we understand you've been very busy, Mark. Jackie has a question. In your book, Considering Benzodiazepines, you talk about returning to the dose at which the patient was last stable during a taper. If the taper was too fast over a period of 9 months, how do you find what is considered a stable dose versus protracted symptoms, if using symptoms as a guide on how high to go back up?
I mean, the answer is there's no, hard and fast rule. If you're unsure, I would taper up. So, if someone's gone from 10 milligrams of Valium down to 2 and they're in total mess, and you're not sure what dose would make them feel better, and you're not sure if it's 10 or it should be 4, well, I would try to kind of thread the needle by going up a little bit every week or two, whether that's a milligram every couple of weeks, it depends on people's responses. If they feel better, that might encourage you to go a bit quicker. If they feel worse, it might encourage you to rethink what you're doing, but you might, up titrate the dose slowly rather than trying to pick a winning number.
And Lori F writes, do you have any information about reoccurrence of akathisia if you're using a hyperbolic taper?
I mean, I guess if you've experienced akathisia in coming off your drug, I guess it's a bit like breaking your leg playing sport. You probably are more vulnerable to doing it again compared to someone that has never broken their leg. So I would be particularly careful in terms of what the rates are. I don't know, but I guess if you've had a terrible time coming off once, it would make me more cautious in going off the next time.
And then we also have a question about delayed withdrawals. Is it a withdrawal if symptoms only appear after a few months of going off? So if someone is on their medication, they've been off for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, is it still considered a withdrawal reaction?
So, I mean, when I first started seeing patients and someone said to me that I had withdrawal that was delayed by 2 months after they stopped their drug, I believed in withdrawal. I'd experienced it myself, but I found that very hard to believe. I thought, how can, the drug leaves your body in a few days? How can it happen in 2 months? And I thought, this must be something else. Then I saw it again 3 months later. I've seen people 6 months. I've seen it so many times with such typical symptoms, headache, dizziness, brain zaps, that I don't understand the biology behind it, but it must be, you can't have, if you have onset of dizziness, headache, depersonalization, brain zaps months after stopping a drug, what else would it be? It would have to be a very strange neurological condition that just happens to happen a few months after stopping an antidepressant that has the exact same symptoms as withdrawal. And so I think it must be something like, downstream effects that take time to reach a threshold. It makes me think of Mousetrap. You drop the ball, it goes down this, that kids board game. It goes down the stairs, it kicks the thing that kicks the bucket. It takes a while for the cage to fall on the mouse. So I think I don't understand the biology of it, but yes, I've seen it so many times. I can't see what else it would be, unless it's a relapse, if it's very typical of previous episodes, if it's because something has gone wrong in your life, then maybe it's a relapse. But I guess if it's got very typical withdrawal symptoms, then I would have a high index of suspicion for it.
Here's a question from Steve. What do you do if you're in protracted withdrawals, but you still have to taper? If someone is very unstable on a liquid, but wants to do a micro-taper, what should they do? And should they do a compounded capsule or shaved tablets? Then how do you micro-taper?
They sound like very, very, very general questions. I'll answer it anyway. Look, I've got to say, if you're very unstable, tapering may not be the best thing. My approach is, I know people do it. I guess you got to weigh up the pros and cons. I guess you got to weigh up the harms of staying on the drug versus the harms of coming off the drug. How does that weigh up? I often think that if people are very unstable, it's much harder to taper. So I sort of might use the analogy of break your leg playing sport. It's much easier to wait until your leg heals before going back to your sport, rather than going back too early, re-injuring it, and sort of prolonging the entire process. But I also appreciate people sitting there for years waiting, just want to do something, in which case, I think doing it very, very carefully makes the most sense. Maybe that means a very slow micro-taper. It sounds like the second question is micro-taper, if liquids don't work, is it better to get a compounded tablet or to weigh it yourself? Yeah. I guess there's issues of cost, but probably getting a professional to do it will be more accurate than doing it yourself.
I'm just looking to see other questions that haven't been answered. These have kind of been answered. Some of these have been answered before, but in some of your talks. Have you seen people successfully come off meds after they've already experienced a 10 out of 10 protracted withdrawal experience?
I have. I've seen people who have had very terrible times coming off their drugs, then waited to get better. If they've ended up back on the drugs, waited for things to settle down, and then come off slowly. I think I would have had a 9.5 out of 10 bad experience coming off my drugs initially, and I've come off my drugs in the end. I've seen people who have had worse symptoms than me and have come off eventually. It probably does take longer if you've had a very bad time, but yes, I think it is possible.
Here's just a kind of do you find people that are taking medications for bipolar antipsychotics have more difficult time than antidepressants?
Good question. I think there's two parts to that. There's the differences between the drugs, and there's the difference between people's conditions. So I think if someone is much more prone to instability, if they're more prone to being up and down, that makes it harder to come off medications, because if you've got already a bit of an inclination that way, drugs can further destabilize things. Is lithium, for example, or antipsychotics harder to come off than antidepressants? I've sort of heard, I don't have first-hand experience of lithium and antipsychotics, so I can't answer it from my perspective. I've heard different views. I've heard people say to me that antipsychotics are much harder to come off than antidepressants, and I've heard the other way around. So I'm not actually sure what the answer to that is. Someone's saying both hard. Fair enough.
Antonia asks about micro-tapering off of an SNRI drug.
Right. So taking venlafaxine as an example, you've got a couple of different options. In the UK, it comes as a liquid. In America, you get a compounding pharmacy to make up a liquid version of it. You often need to take it twice a day because it won't have the slow release properties that the beads have. So you can microtaper by using a liquid and syringe. You can also kind of microtaper with beads. So, for example, if you've got 300 beads, you're going to go down by 10%. That would be a 30 bead reduction. You could break that into 1 bead every day. So you can microtaper with beads. At some point, you might need to go down a bead every second day or third day. So you can sort of make it smaller. Maybe not a daily microtaper, but you can do it. You can do a microtaper for duloxetine or Cymbalta. That the same kind of thing can operate for bead counting. Again, you can do it with beads. You can't liquefy duloxetine, so that option doesn't exist. So you can microtaper SNRIs.
Right. Is there anything else that you want to add, Mark, for barriers for our providers that are listening?
There's a couple of questions here that I would like to answer. Number one is someone's asked a couple of times, why do I think that 30% people failed hyperbolic tapering in the Dutch studies? And the answer is very simple. They went too quickly. So in the Dutch studies, the average time to come off the drugs, I think, was about 2 months. So it was a hyperbolic taper, but there's hyperbolic tapers and there's hyperbolic tapers. So, testing hyperbolic tapers doesn't mean you just give someone a quick go off. So I think it clearly means that if they went slower, more people would be able to get off. I mean, in my clinical experience, basically everyone gets off if they do a hyperbolic taper. It just might take them 5 years. So I don't think that means that some people can't come off, for example. And then the other question is someone asking, what are your thoughts on using ketamine to help get through the depression antidepressants cause? I sort of lost the end of it. I couldn't think of anything that would be more unwise. It's sort of like saying, you're having trouble with beer, so maybe let's try heroin. If you're getting trouble, I don't know if you're referring to withdrawal effects or from the side effects of the drug, but, you're not going to fix chemical issues with another chemical. So if it's withdrawal you're talking about, I wouldn't use another drug to sort of suppress the symptoms. I would just go slower or wait it out because, of course, ketamine, I sort of say in the past they used to use drugs that were similar to street drugs in psychiatry, and now they're just using street drugs in psychiatry. Ketamine is highly toxic to the brain. It shrinks animal brains in time. In humans, it causes chronic depression in long-term use. It's highly addictive, highly dependence-forming, has a severe withdrawal syndrome. So you'd be swapping, one cruel master for a much crueler master. So I don't think that's a very good idea.
Great answer, Mark. Here's a question. Can people do a liquid taper off of mirtazapine using just water and no syrup?
Yes. So, people, why do people use syrup? So most drugs are not fully soluble in water. They form suspensions. And there's 2 ways to get around that. One is to shake suspension. So anything in your medicine cabinet at home that says shake well before use is a suspension. So lots of drugs we have are suspensions. And if you shake it, it separates things sort of homogeneously throughout the liquid, a bit like a snow globe at Christmas time. If you shake it up, it separates, the snow gets mixed throughout. Of course, in a snow globe, the snow is made of plastic, is extremely insoluble, whereas mirtazapine and other psychiatric drugs are more soluble than plastic. So a good shake works out well. And the other option is to put in something that is syrupy. So maple syrup or Aura Plus, there's different formulations you can buy. And it's a bit using the idea that the drugs sink slower in syrup rather than water. So you have to shake it less because the liquid holds it. So either option is permissible, to use a syrup and shake it, or just to shake it very well without a syrup. I think both are reasonable options.
Okay, let's do one more question since we're hitting to the top of the hour here. At what point after discontinuing a med, that wasn't done hyperbolically, are the disadvantages to return to the med and do a hyperbolic taper? So I guess someone is asking here about reinstating back to the drug. And just continue or pushing it through, does it eventually clear up?
So that sort of comes back to those options that I presented in my last slide. Your options are to wait for it to get better. And the answer is, it generally does get better. The question is, will it take weeks, months, or years? And of course, if it took weeks, I think no brainer, of course, just hold on. If it takes months, maybe it is worth holding on. If it takes years, it could be a different situation, depends on how severe the symptoms are. Then the other option is to go back on the drug, and that has uncertainty. I guess there's uncertainties on both sides. There's uncertainties about how long it'll take to recover, and there's uncertainties about what going back on the drug will produce. So, some people, when they go back on the drug, they feel a lot better quite quickly, and those people are absolutely delighted. There are people who go back on the drug and they don't feel better or worse. They feel just the same, and now they're back on the drug, so they're not particularly happy. And there are people who go back on the drug and they feel worse. They call that a paradoxical reaction. And they're pretty unhappy people because they're back on the drug. They feel worse. They've got a bit of a decision to make, whether to sort of throw the drug in the bin or to hold on. So the answer is there's uncertainty on both sides. If you are going to try reinstatement, I think the way to minimize the risk is to go down to a very small dose when you go back on it. So, if you've come off 15 milligrams of a drug, don't go back on 15, go back on 0.5 milligrams. Dip your toe in the water, see how it feels before diving in the deep end. So it's a very tough decision that you've got, that you're on the
and there's no crystal ball to know how it's going to work. That's the bad part. Well, we'd like to thank you, Mark, for joining us today. You've been very helpful in answering a bunch of questions and going over the tips with us and the barriers. And we just can't thank you enough for all of your time and all your research and staying the good course for our community. Thank you.
Thanks for hosting me.